Dr. Malcolm Guite is an English poet, a Cambridge professor, a respected academic author, as well as an Anglican priest. Raised in Nigeria by parents who embrace language and literature, Malcolm was nurtured through diversity of culture and rich appreciation for the imagination.
Malcolm is described as a questing poet whose poems point to places of possibilities in everything from the commonplace to the transcendent. His unique observations demonstrate a passion for living vibrantly within the complexities of life. You know, Rachel, of all the people we've interviewed this first season of Family 360, I am pretty confident that our guest this week, Dr. Malcolm Guite, is the most diverse.
You mean like as far as credentials go?
Well, yeah, he's a poet, he's a priest, a professor, a writer, a singer-songwriter.
A saint?
A saint? You feel like he's a saint?
No, I was just going with your alliteration there. I don't think, well, maybe he's a saint. I don't know, a whiskey-drinking saint.
Yeah.
It's certainly the first interview we've ever done where the guest has drank whiskey as we spoke.
I know, although he did not get a lot of time to sit because he had
Probably
so
a good
much
thing.
to say. Yeah, and he really kept you on your toes.
He did. But I really appreciated how often he went back into talking about his own childhood or his children as reference to what was meaningful in his life.
I know. He seemed very appreciative of his childhood and very grateful for his parents.
I know. It's encouraging to hear positive family of origin stories.
Well, it is. So this is the first of a two-part conversation with Dr. Guite. We're calling it Keys to the Imagination.
He's very big on imagination.
He is very big on imagination. Two very interesting episodes. And now for part one.
Thank you for listening to Family 360.
Not only should parents not be constantly trying to push their kids to think about the future all the time, but on the contrary, parents should see the gift of children as the opportunity to live again in the present, and that actually kids are sent to you not so you can visit your ambitions upon them, but so that they can undermine and subvert your crummy ambitions.
I'm Rachel Cram.
And I'm Roy Salmond, and welcome to Family 360.
Conversations exploring life together. Malcolm, thank you so much for coming into the studio today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I know you're in the middle of a very busy North American tour, but we've got your whiskey in front of you, your coffee, and your water. So
yes,
you should.
That's fine, yeah. Coming to the end of the tour, actually, so that's nice. So I'm in this demob happy, as we say in England, you know, when you're just about to be released. You say, oh, I'm going to be free.
Okay. Well, I hope you feel free as we talk today.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to start with a question that we often begin our interviews with. A question prompted by the sentiments of Aristotle when he said, "Give me a child at 7 and I will show you the adult." Is there, Malcolm, a story or an experience from your childhood that has shaped the adult that you are today?
If I look back to my earliest memories up to 7, I wouldn't say it was a single thing, but I think there were certain constant elements of my childhood that have shaped me. The first and most obvious one was that I was born and brought up in Africa, in Nigeria, and it was very much a kind of multicultural, multiracial thing. My dad was a professor at the university there, teaching a generation of young Nigerians who were going to eventually take the independence of the country forward. Some great literary figures like Chinua Achebe was one of them. And so the house was always full of people with different races and languages. And I loved Africa. I loved the drama of it. I particularly loved the big thunderstorms. So one of my very earliest memories is a thunderstorm and torrential rain and the rain bouncing off and just having an irrepressible desire to go out and jump around in it, which I did. In fact, I tore my clothes off and went around and jumped in the rain. And my dad would probably think that wasn't proper behavior. But my mother totally understood it.
Your mum loves poetry too, is that correct?
Yeah. She's 100 now and is still reciting poetry to me.
Wow.
I thought everybody's mother did that. It just flowed. And I think I recognized very early that there was a thing called poetry that lifted and drew and filled you with wonder. And it just came effortlessly and entirely naturally from my mother. So much so that, I mean, later on when I did go to school and meet other kids, you know, I probably was chatting with some kids saying, you know that thing when your mum quotes Milton, whatever. And I was like, oh, that's not, I didn't
Not everyone's mum does
Not
it.
everyone's mum does that.
Well, that must have given you an accessibility to language, a vocabulary. that, in retrospect, maybe you realize was uncommon for other young
in
children.
retrospect. But it meant that I never thought of literature and poetry as a task or even a subject. Like, I couldn't believe that there was a subject at school called English where you sit and read books and talk to people about them, because that's what I would be doing if I wasn't at school. That was like a time off for me.
And maybe that's why you're a professor.
It is.
Your childhood kind of set you up for that.
Yeah, I mean, I should say the other thing, of course, was that my father, who was less demonstrative, but actually had an extraordinary vocabulary, and he used to take great pleasure whenever we used a particular word or he taught us a new word. He would tell us its Latin roots. And we'd see how kind of language developed. And the other thing was that my father was, as well as being a classicist, was a Methodist local preacher. So he had quite a strong faith, quite a radical faith in some respects. My mother was less upfront or demonstrative about faith, less dogmatic in a way. I mean, she had more of a sense of wonder, I think. But my father also had a great sense of music, and we used to have this rickety old piano, which never stayed in tune because it was in the tropics, But Dad would sometimes sit and play hymns. That was my first sense of music and musical things. And there was a lovely children's hymn that my dad used to sing, which was called Tell Me the Stories of Jesus. My dad would do these special effects on the piano. So my favourite bit was there's a bit in that hymn which goes, "Tell me in accents of wonder how rolled the sea, tossing the boat in a tempest on Galilee." And my dad would do all these big crashing wave sounds, on the piano down below. And he'd throw in a minor key, and he'd do these little melancholy bird songs. So he had that sort of creative thing as well.
You're describing such a rich, vibrant sounding childhood, and parents who sounded like they had some pretty amazing parenting skills. How old were you when you came over to your family moved to England?
So we were there in Nigeria till I was 7, and then we moved to Zimbabwe as it is now, Rhodesia as it was then. And then when I was 10 in 1967, we left in fairly dramatic circumstances as it happened, because while we were there, Rhodesia under Ian Smith illegally declared independence and began a series of repressive racist measures. And my father protested against that and resigned his job in the university and became a marked man and was eventually expelled from the country. So we actually became political refugees and we had to leave. And luckily, my dad's old college in Cambridge found us somewhere temporary to live in Cambridge. So I came when I was 10 to Cambridge, not knowing that that would be my whole future, that actually Cambridge is where I would end up living most of my life.
Wow, that's remarkable.
And we were there for some months, and then Dad got a job in Canada, in Hamilton, Ontario.
So do you feel you have your feet in different countries?
Yeah.
A little bit nomadic? Like you're not African, you're not Canadian, you're not British. That must shape your perspectives, I would think, growing up in such different cultures.
Yeah. I've talked to other people of my generation who, like me, were born and brought up in colonies or former colonies, who imbibed a different culture and then came back to England as English and yet not English.
Yes.
And I think it gives you a slightly different perspective. I love England. I mean, I think the combination of beer and poetry made me feel that I belong to the English tradition.
And your pipe.
And, the pipe and things. So I don't see England as being defined for me by either place or race, but by a sense of shared culture. And it's a shared culture that's always changing and growing. And, of course, the English language itself is the product of a series of immigrations and emigrations. Our language has Celtic roots, and then the Saxons come over, it gives it Germanic roots, and then the Vikings arrive and gives it Danish roots, and then the Normans invade, and we have all these French words. So the very richness of the English language is a meeting of races and cultures eventually blending to produce this beautiful new thing. And I very strongly resist any notions of English or British nationalism that are xenophobic, that say, oh, these people shouldn't be coming over or they should speak, because we only are who we are because of a series of waves. Human life did not originate on the British Isles.
No.
We're all immigrants. We've become who we are by learning to share each other's stories and making a new story out of those common stories. And it may be that having been brought up as a European child in Nigeria, and therefore not quite belonging to the culture there, has made me much more aware of what it might feel like to be an incomer into my own culture, and much more open to how that's a gift and an opportunity rather than something to be resented.
I'm wondering, Malcolm, if this discussion around fitting in might be a good stepping stone into one of your best known poems. Can we look at your poem, The Singing Bowl? Because
Sure.
I think it speaks of this in a way, of the journey to find our own sense of belonging and the importance of that journey.
Yeah. So would you like to hear the singing bowl?
I would love
just
you to
so
read it.
you're-
Thank you.
So, what a singing bowl, I don't know if you're
Describe it.
listeners. So a singing bowl is a very beautiful bronze bowl which is developed in Tibet. You just run the beater round and round the edge, a bit like people putting their fingers round, a wine glass to make the wine glass. And it sort of trembles into sound. And it produces the most wonderful harmonics. So you start with one sound and you can feel the tremor of it. And then suddenly these great singing notes arise. It sort of heightens and deepens. And yet you've never struck the thing. You've just caressed it into sound. So that's a metaphor that comes in this poem. So here's the singing bowl. Begin the song exactly where you are. Remain within the world of which you're made. Call nothing common in the earth or air. Accept it all and let it be for good. Start with the very breath you breathe in now, this moment's pulse, this rhythm in your blood, and listen to it, ringing, soft and low. Stay with the music. Words will come in time. Slow down your breathing. Keep it deep and slow. Become an open singing bowl, whose chime is richness rising out of emptiness, and timelessness resounding into time. And when the heart is full of quietness, begin the song exactly where you are.
Listening to you reminds me, last night at your poetry reading, a young boy put up his hand and you asked him what his question was. And he had what I thought was a brilliant question. I don't know if you can remember it, but he said to you, do you write your poetry from wisdom or from imagination? Do you remember that question?
It's great. It was a great question.
It was a great question.
And I think I said back to him that the great discovery for me of poetry, both reading and writing it, is that it's the imagination itself that brings you a wisdom you didn't have. And that if there's a wisdom in my poetry anywhere, it's probably a wisdom I need rather than the wisdom that I possess. And it kind of comes to me through the imagination.
So in light of that, you end the singing bowl with the line about beginning exactly where you are. Does this tie in? Is that an important part of a healthy imagination?
I think the where you are thing is really important. If it happens that you have a quick mind and an imagination, one of the temptations of that is to be constantly fantasizing about being someplace else. As Shakespeare says in one of his sonnets, desiring this man's art or that man's scope. And because I love the past so much, and I'm so moved by the poets of the 17th century like John Donne and George Herbert, that period, the late 18th, early 19th century, everything about it, the excitement of the French Revolution, the fabulous things that were going on in language, just the way men dressed, the kind of waistcoats. I would look at that and I think, why wasn't I born then? I'm a natural born romantic. And there came a point where I realized where I am is astonishing, that there is as much available for wonder and amazement in any place that anybody is as there is in any other place. And funnily enough, one of the very poets that I wished I'd been a contemporary of was Coleridge. And Coleridge said, I hope that our poetry will remove the film of familiarity that our selfishness and solicitude has cast over the world, which is full of wonder and freshness, but for which we have eyes and see not, ears and hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. And I suddenly thought, that's right. What I love about all that poetry is it makes me look at the same view, the same sunset or sunrise, the same whisper of wind in the trees that I've walked past 100 times. And then I read their poem and I say, oh my goodness, something astonishing is happening here.
Oh, what an amazing phrase. Removing the film of familiarity.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Can you say more about that?
Those words of Coleridge really helped me to sort of say, I must be where I am. And I realized that actually that's really important. Remain within the world of which you're made. But I say that to myself about remain within, not because I do it all the time, but because like everybody else, I flung off.
Well, we all do. We fly off so easily and miss, at least this is what I think you're saying, we leave our own realities and miss the chance to be that singing bowl.
Yeah. I think we're living in a world in which endless possibilities of communication in cyberspace means it's increasingly difficult to remain within the world of which you're made. It's increasingly difficult to actually be fully and wholly present in the place you are to the person you're with. And I begin to see that now as a spiritual discipline. You can read lots of early manuals of spiritual exercises where the whole discipline is to get out of the world and into the heavenly realm. And actually, I think now the discipline is the other way around entirely. We're trying to use spiritual discipline in order to remain present. Not present in a closed way, present in a way which allows the wonder.
We wrestle with time as human beings. And you've talked about wanting to go back into the past.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us, maybe this is a generalization, but particularly young people can also look at always wanting to get into the future.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
What's coming up next. And it's very difficult to be in the present.
It is very difficult.
And I'm just thinking for yourself, even as a father, how do you bring people into that awareness in an earthy way?
Yeah. Well, the thing about the present moment, there's a wonderful bit in one of C.S. Lewis's Screwtape letters, which you may remember. He writes them as an older devil writing to a younger devil about how to tempt human beings.
Brilliant.
And so there's a really great one about time where Screwtape, the devil, is writing, saying, what you've got to do is try and separate your patient, i.e. the person you're trying to tempt, from reality. So he says, what you've got to do is get him either off into the past in nostalgia, or concentrate his mind on the future, either in anxiety about the future or in a series of sort of fantastical wish fulfillment hopes about it. And then the letter says, neither the past nor the future are as real as the present, because the past is frozen and no longer flows, and the future doesn't exist at all except as speculation. But the present is all lit up with golden rays. The present is the point at which time touches eternity. Now, I read that, I guess, in my early 20s. And again, these things stay with you. So you mentioned being a father. Naturally, as a parent, you're really keen for your kids to do well, and you're not going to be here forever, and you're kind of anxious that they should get on in life and stuff like that. But I see this quite often because I have students at Cambridge who often have very ambitious parents. And one of the reasons why they're there at all is that their parents have pushed them, and they've loaded their kids with all this anxiety about they've got to do this and they've got to get the first job, and then that's going to be the career opportunity for the next one. And parents are almost exercises their own ambition through their children. And the parents' focus on the child is work hard now, and then you can get this job, and then you'll start living life, then it's a constantly postponed reward. Now, I'm not saying that you don't have to tell your kids to do their homework, but I see the damage that some of that's done in student stress and mental health issues, So one of the things that I've begun to see for myself is that actually not only should parents not be constantly trying to push their kids to think about the future all the time and live in the future, but on the contrary, parents should see the gift of children as the opportunity to learn from their children to live again in the present. And that actually kids are sent to you not so you can visit your ambitions upon them, but so that they can undermine and subvert your crummy ambitions and get you to spend less time at the office and more time fishing or holding hands or going for walks or going to a game together or, tinkering with motorcycles or whatever it is. And I would say that, one of the experiences of having kids for me has been precisely that sense of being right there in the moment. Now, as it happens, I've got 2 children, and one of them is very bright and has, gone off to university, but the other one has reasonably serious learning difficulties and quite a low reading age, and has no qualification of any kind whatsoever. And I love them both completely, and obviously, absolutely. So just the experience of having 2 children that you love deeply, who have a whole completely different range of gifts, because my son, who doesn't have the educational attainments, has a tremendous spirit and a great sense of can-do and just where he is. I mean, I'll give you a classic example. My son, from when he's very little, loved vehicles of any kind. He loved watching cars and he played with cars. And buses in particular, just because they're big and noisy, exciting. He once said to me, he was about 5 or 6, he said, "Dad, can't you wait for Thursday?" And I was going like, "What's happening on Thursday?" And he said, "We're going to the dentist on Thursday." And I said, "David, yeah, I know. I've been trying not to think about it. I thought we didn't like to go to the dentist." And he said, "Yeah, Dad, I don't want to go. But, Dad, we're going on a bus." And just the fact that we were going to be on a bus. I ride buses all the time. I ride trains and planes, and I'm just blasé about it. And I sometimes think if I was in the spirit of my son, everything about it, the way the seats are, the little knobs you can turn on the air, the lights, the people coming and going, everything about being on a plane or a bus would just be fantastic to my son.
And that's about being in the present,
It's about being in the present. And also, the situation of his having these difficulties simply meant that the entire arena of my having any kind of worldly ambitions for him or thinking that he was going to be validated in some way by, which I think some parents somehow think that they or their children are going to be validated by getting these degrees or jobs. That was not even a consideration. So I was confronted immediately that he's already validated. He's already validated by being human, and he's already loved because he's my son.
Can I ask you a question? Does this, your life with your children, does this influence your perspective on success?
Yeah.
Because I think there's a generational shift happening in how success is perceived.
Right.
If you were to ask your students at Cambridge what success meant to them, what kind of answers do you think that they would give you?
Well, I get an immense variety of answers. And obviously there's some that are doing vocational courses like being a doctor or whatever, and when I ask them what made them want to do it, there's usually a very deep core about compassion and helping. And so the success then becomes that you heal somebody, that you help somebody, and they know that. But it's not very difficult for that initial core reason for doing the thing to get lost in a lot of other things. So I think one of the problems about Cambridge is a wonderful place, and it's got extraordinary riches and opportunities, and but obviously it's very competitive to get there. And then the examination system in Cambridge is everybody's literally ranked in order. And they don't do this anymore, but in my day, they publicly posted, before you yourself had been told, up on a public notice board, everybody's results in order, literally ranked. So there was a top student, and it just went down in numbers. And you were publicly put on a grid.
Well, there's a lot of things in our culture that actually make it very difficult to live in the present, isn't there? And comparison's a huge one.
Yeah.
What's the danger of comparison?
So that I think the danger of that, it's perfectly reasonable to say somebody's better at mathematics than somebody else. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. The danger is when that being better at mathematics is mistaken for being a better person. So I actually see most of my role as a chaplain at Cambridge as actually consciously and deliberately subverting the competitive culture. So I say to the students, go ahead and do your exams, and I hope you do well, and study for them by all means, but never believe for a minute that you are less worthy of your place in life and your unique gifts of being a human that you're less worthy because you got a 2-1 from the person who got a first. The 2-1 and the first are very specific indications about how well you can do in exams, but you must never mistake that for personal validation. And I think that's a really important thing to preserve all the time. You know?
You said imagination is the bridge between the world known and the world unknown. So how do we trust that bridge to guide our journey to the world unknown, our life ahead of us? Because even thinking back on my own university years and even on my career years, leaning into imagination rather than staying on the well-worn paths of knowledge, it requires a confidence and a willingness to take risks.
Right. Well, I think that comment about the imagination is a development really of two things. One, an insight I had from Shakespeare, and another from Copernicus. So,
Okay, we haven't had Shakespeare and Copernicus in an interview yet, so I love it. Keep going.
Exactly. So Shakespeare has this thing where he says, imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. That's really true, not only poetically, that, you know, you have a half-felt thing and you've never been able to quite put it in the words, and then suddenly this poem or this work of art does that for you and brings into the realm of knowledge something only half guessed at. But that's not even just true of poetry and the arts. In the history of science, it's true. So we have an idea of what the world is like, and we have a model of it, and we get used to it. And we think that's the total reality, and it never is. So the classic example of that was when everybody, quite understandably and very sensibly, thought that the Earth was the center of the cosmos and that the sun went round the Earth. Because when you stand, you see it, you know, you can actually stand, you see it going. Because that's what they knew. And nobody could imagine or guess anything else until you get Copernicus saying, just imagine for a minute if the sun was the center and the planets were going round it, and the Earth was turning, and that's why we get the effect of it. Just to, you know, imagine what that would be like. And it was a massive act of imagination. But having imagined it, then people could say, well, let me just do the maths now. Let me look at the astronomical observations. And suddenly all this stuff that didn't quite fit the old model made total sense. So a leap of the imagination actually changed a model of knowing and gave us new insights. And that's happened again, you know, with Einstein. And it's going to happen again. Do you know what I mean? The models we've got now are temporary.
Well, which really brings into question the way we've constructed our educational systems, where I believe we really want to, hope to make space for wonder and imagination. But instead, sometimes I think we get distracted by other pursuits.
Absolutely.
So this is the end of part 1 in our interview with poet, priest, and Cambridge professor, Dr. Malcolm Guite. There's so much more to explore in this conversation with Malcolm.
Yes, so our next release will be part 2, which picks up right from where we left off with continued discussion around how we can change what Malcolm describes as outdated models of knowing.
Yeah, in part 2, Malcolm shares his ideas around education, work, and relationships that will encourage and inspire leaps in our imaginative and innovative thought.
So here's an excerpt from part 2 as Malcolm discusses the balance between work and play and its effect on the imagination.
To exercise your imagination well requires a little bit of leisure, a little bit of free space. And we've created a society in which some people have to work so hard that they have no leisure at all. Now, I think starving and repressing a person's imagination is just as bad as starving and repressing their body, possibly worse.
So please join us for part 2 of our interview with Dr. Malcolm Guite
on Family 360. Thank you for listening to Family 360.
If you like what you're hearing, please subscribe.
Rate the show, leave a comment, and tell a friend. It's our custom to end each episode with music inspired by the words of our guest.
You've heard pieces of Malcolm's music throughout this interview, and we're going to end with a recorded version of his well-known poem, the one you heard in this interview, The Singing Bowl.
We hope you enjoy it.
Singing Bowl. Begin the song exactly where you are. Remain within the world of which you're made. Call nothing common in the earth or air. Accept it all, and let it be for good. Start with the very breath you breathe in now, this moment's pulse, this rhythm in your blood, and listen to it, ringing, soft and low. Stay with the music. Words will come in time. Slow down your breathing. Keep it deep and slow. Become an open singing bowl, whose chime is richness rising out of emptiness, and timelessness resounding into time. And when the heart is full of quietness, begin the song exactly where you are.
I'm Rachel Cram.
I'm Roy Salmond, and thank you so much for listening to Family 360.
To continue these conversations, find us at Family 360 on our website, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.
We'd love to journey with you.